Welcome back to Module 8 of Classical Mythology. Here we are continuing our look at the god Dionysus and some of the controversy associated with him and how he's been received in later time periods. Now, one of the methodological theoretical perspectives that is useful when considering Dionysus in a mythological context comes from the anthropologist Victor Turner. He was interested in performance arts and festivals and how they allow people to change social values. He explores the concept of liminality, so that implies the idea of boundaries and divisions between various groups and types of experience. And he connects these performance-related rituals to the idea of rites of passage. And he sought to identify various stages of the rite of passage. First, the preliminal stage, where the participant leaves behind their identity and changes their appearance. Then we have the liminal stage, which involves trials, hardships, ordeals, resulting in knowledge and insight. Finally, we have the post-liminal stage, where the individual reintegrates into their social setting, bringing with them a new sort of knowledge, possibly even a new sort of identity. And Turner was particularly interested in the middle stage, this ambiguous, undefined, and transitional moment of transformation within the rite of passage. At this stage, the initiate is invited to reflect upon social roles, either consciously or unconsciously, and their place in society. For Turner, the same dynamics are at play in performance art. You have disguise, adoption of new identities, questioning of social roles. In the context of Dionysus, the Dionysian rituals allowed people to shed social conventions. Wine and intoxication encouraged them to act outside their social roles and to at least temporarily adopt a new identity and play that identity out. So looking back to Livy's account of the Bacchanalia, you can see why, conservative Roman authorities would have been very concerned about people stepping outside their traditional social roles and kind of experimenting with their identity in the context of a religious festival that involved, ritual intoxication. But this sort of rite of passage is inherently dangerous because it leads to the questioning of society and even potentially the destruction of the self. So as much as the rite of passage can lead to a productive reassessment and transformation, it can also lead to a disintegration. And the imagery of dismemberment is quite commonplace in stories and rituals associated with the Dionysus. Now, Livy provided us with one account of a certain manifestation of the Dionysian rituals, the Bacchanalia. And as we saw, this was a very negative, I would say sensationalizing account meant to discredit the festival, and it contained many of the tropes, as we saw, that are still applied to cult movements and new religious movements ever since. But we have a different sort of account from the remains of Pompeii, which, as I'm sure you've heard, is a small Roman town that was covered during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. As a result of the city being suddenly covered in Ash, many important paintings, wall paintings and frescoes were preserved, whereas much of Roman painting doesn't survive in other contexts. In one structure in particular, we have a triclinium, which is a kind of lounge in a Roman villa, that contains a fairly elaborate series of wall paintings that most scholars would interpret as an account of an initiation ritual, and one that specifically involves the god Dionysus. So this is a non-textual account. And after all, adherents and initiates to the mystery religions were required to take a vow of secrecy, so it wasn't permitted for them to describe what they experienced in any kind of verbal or textual form. But this series of paintings does provide us with an interesting kind of visual vocabulary that closely fits the sort of scenario put forward by Turner in terms of a rite of passage. So we're going to walk through this iconography that forms a very deliberate sequence of images that tell a particular story of initiation. Now we have to assume that the central figure in each one of the panels is the same person, the initiate. So we have a female figure arriving on the scene at the far left. So this is who I'm calling the initiate. And as she arrives, there's a sort of attendant waiting, as well as a child reading from a parchment. So this implies some kind of ritual kind of texts or welcoming ceremony. Then we see her with much of her clothing removed. This is part of the preparation stage of the rite of passage as she advances further in the initiation sequence. Then in the center we have another set of attendants who are helping with the preparations, providing her with a new form of garment. Next to them on the right we have three figures who all display Dionysian sort of imagery. We have an old man playing a harp. He's known as a Silenus. He's a sort of spirit of the wilderness connected to Bacchus, as well as two satyrs. One is playing a pipe while the other nurses a goat. The goat is also an animal associated with Dionysus in myth traditions. Then we see our initiate again, but in this instance she's fleeing and in a state of fear and alarm. So at this point she's encountering the kind of central stage. She's entering the liminal phase, which involves information and knowledge that is unsettling and frightening. So her initial reaction to that is a sort of panic. Then on the next wall, in the next series of panels, on the left we have another set of Dionysian figures. We have a Silenus again, who's holding either a bowl or a kind of mirror, and behind him are again the sort of satyr figures, one of which is holding a mask. So here we're back to this idea of identity and changing appearance and masks, all things that are associated with Dionysus in particular, but also these sort of performance ritual protocols. In the center, however, we have a youthful deity reclining on the lap of a seated woman. And across the lap of this deity is a staff known as a thyrsus. And this is undeniably Dionysus. So that's an important signal to the identity of the deity who is presiding over this rite of passage. And even though part of the painting doesn't survive at the center top there, he's likely reclining on the lap of Ariadne, his consort. So this image could represent a kind of sacred union of the deity with his partner as symbolically important to this liminal stage of the rite of passage. To their right, we have our initiate again. In this instance, she's uncovering a ritual object, which may be a sort of phallus. So this implies that there might be some kind of sexual dimension to the ritual, or at least use of sexual symbolism. Next, we have another female figure. This one is wearing a costume involving wings, but she carries in her hand a whip and is preparing to strike. That brings us to the next panel. There we have our initiate again, who is preparing to be struck by the whip. So this is the sort of trial ordeal phase of the initiation, and this sort of ritual flagellation is well known for many sorts of religious rituals throughout the world. To the right of that, we have the initiate again, but in a kind of pose of celebration as she has come out the other side of the ritual and is twirling and playing the cymbals in an act of ritual dance. In the center, we then have the initiate seems to be preparing herself, possibly for a wedding. As we saw when we were looking at Artemis, often the sort of rituals associated particularly with women in ancient Greece and Rome as well had to do with maturity and passing into womanhood. Finally, we have the initiate at the far right, looking back at the whole sequence of events. So that's sort of her reflecting on her experience of initiation from a more mature vantage point. And it's likely that this is the individual who commissioned these paintings to begin with, the occupant and owner of the villa. So these paintings from Pompeii provide us with some very important evidence as to the sort of sequence of events of a initiation ritual associated with the mystery religions, particularly the mysteries of Dionysus. And as a whole, the Dionysian imagery of the whole sequence is really undeniable. But we do see this is also unique in terms of the emphasis placed on a woman being the primary initiate. Now, much of Pompeii was excavated in the 19th and early 20th centuries, about the time when these paintings would have been uncovered. This was also a period in which the figure of Dionysus exerted a certain fascination with some European intellectuals and philosophers, in this case Friedrich Nietzsche, who had a particular sort of obsession with Dionysus, as well as his theory of the dynamic interrelationship between Dionysus and the god Apollo. And according to his life story, toward the end of his life, he started to kind of identify himself with Dionysus, and even signed some of his correspondence with Dionysus instead of his usual name. There were, of course, other factors, health-wise and psychologically, that were also influencing Nietzsche's behavior towards the end of his life. But he says in this particular letter, "Inasmuch as I want to do mankind a boundless favor, I give them my dithyrambs." Dithyrambs, this is a type of poetry text associated with Dionysus in these ancient Greek festivals in honor of the god. "I place them in the hands of the poet of Isoline, the first and greatest satyr alive today, and not only today." He signs his name Dionysus. Now, as I mentioned, Nietzsche was also, from a more theoretical perspective, interested in the figure of Dionysus as representing what he thought to be a kind of important force in human experience. And he talked extensively in his works, especially The Birth of Tragedy, in which he explored the origins of the Greek drama tradition. Nietzsche made very extensive use of this opposition between Apollo and Dionysus. And here he describes this Dionysian idea. He says, "These Dionysiac stirrings, which as they grow in intensity cause subjectivity to vanish to the point of complete self-forgetting, awaken either under the influence of narcotic drink, of which all human beings and peoples who are close to the origin of things speak in their hymns, or at the approach of spring, when the whole of the nature is pervaded by lust for life." He says, "In the German Middle Ages, too, ever-growing throngs roam from place to place, impelled by the same Dionysiac power, singing and dancing as they went. In these St. John's and St. Vitus's dancers, we recognize the Bacchic choruses of the Greeks, with their prehistory in Asia Minor extending to Babylon and the orgiastic Sakai." Now, here, whatever you think of Nietzsche's philosophy and his intellectual legacy, here's an example of somebody in the 19th century who's using a kind of mythological archetype as part of a kind of explanatory model for human behavior and what he saw as kind of tendencies in human civilization. So that sort of thing isn't uncommon in 19th century and early 20th century sort of thinking, where someone like Nietzsche is trying to establish a kind of continuity of human experience from antiquity to his own, through the Middle Ages to his own time, and because he was trained as a classicist, he uses and was immersed in ancient mythology. Those served as powerful symbols as he tried to construct this type of explanatory model. He also says, "There are those who, whether from lack of experience or from dullness of spirit, turn away in scorn or pity from such phenomena, regarding them as popular diseases, while believing in their own good health. Of course, these poor creatures have not the slightest inkling of how spectral and deathly pale their health seems, when the glowing life of Dionysiac enthusiasts storm past them. Not only is the bond between human beings renewed by the magic of the Dionysiac, but nature, alienated, inimical, or subjugated, celebrates once more her festival of reconciliation with her lost son, humankind." This whole language and rhetoric is also, I think, connected to Nietzsche's larger critique of Christianity and what he felt was its sort of degenerated effect on European culture, whereas the Dionysian, in his mind, offered a kind of pathway to rediscover a certain kind of quote-unquote pagan vitality that was in short supply from his perspective. Again, I'm not commenting on the merits of Nietzsche's philosophy or even the validity of this sort of paradigm. It's just a very good example of how mythological symbolism gets received and recycled in the modern period. He continues, freely the earth offers up her gifts, and the beasts of prey from mountain and desert approach in peace. The chariot of Dionysus is laden with flowers and wreaths. Beneath its yoke stride panther and tiger. If one were to transform Beethoven's jubilant hymn to joy into a painting and place no constraints on one's imagination as the millions sink into the dust, shivering in awe, then one could begin to approach the Dionysiac. Again, very lofty language. Nietzsche was a huge fan of music. So again, he's connecting the kind of emotional and kind of mystical dimension of the creative process and the experience of art to this aspect of human experience that he identifies as the Dionysian. Now, fast forward a few decades, and we have other examples of how the Dionysian has been used as a sort of aesthetic term. Ever since Nietzsche, this has been a kind of tendency. And in particular, in the 1960s, Dionysus became very much a symbol for the sort of countercultural dynamics that were happening in many societies, particularly Western societies, as embodying a period of experimentation, drug use, political resistance, sexual liberation. So it's not surprising that in this period we see the kind of symbolism of Dionysus and the figure of Dionysus appearing quite frequently in creative works from the period. For example, there was experimental theater in this decade known as Dionysus in '69. The cult classic film, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which is sort of a bit later, but still embodies that same kind of ideology of indulgence and excess and boundary crossing. In this film, Dr. Frankenfurter serves as a kind of Dionysian archetype. And there were many productions of the play by Euripides known as the Bacchae, which is the storyline is built around the figure of Dionysus and the rituals associated with him. So that brings us to the end of our look at the god Dionysus, who has proven to be one of the more enduring and kind of relevant figures, especially in the modern period, not least of which because of people like Nietzsche using him as an important symbol, but also other artists and intellectuals as well. So we'll stop there and continue on in our next module.